Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Chester Arthur, and the focus is finding his niche. The year is 1861. Abraham Lincoln is being inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. A Republican going to the White House had meant secession from the South. 7 states in the preceding months had left the Union. Abraham Lincoln now in the White House, and all eyes are in Charleston, South Carolina. In particular, Charleston Harbor, and right in the middle of that harbor was Fort Sumter. This was the last federally held fort in the entire South, and Abraham Lincoln decided to re-provision that fort in April of 1861. Well, the Confederates had surrounded Fort Sumter. Any act like this, reprovisioning, that was an act of war in their minds, and so they decided to bombard Fort Sumter, force the surrender of the Union soldiers, and the Civil War had begun. Where did Chester Arthur stand in all this? Well, Arthur was a Northerner. He came from an abolitionist family, and he was a Republican. He had actually started out as a Whig. Arthur had been aligned in the 1840s with Henry Clay and his American system, with federally funded internal improvements, high protective tariffs. But the Whig Party had kind of disintegrated in the early 1850s, and a couple of other parties had come to fill the void, including the Republicans, who embraced many of those same Whig tenets with one addition: no more expansion of slavery. That was their line in the sand. Arthur was aligned with this, even though his wife Nell and her family were not so much. They were from the South. They were pro-slavery, pro-Confederate, but not Chester Arthur. This was his political point of view and also his ideological leanings in terms of the war. He wanted to have a role. Well, most of Chester Arthur's opportunities in life came through personal connections, in part because he was so personable. He got along with everyone, and early in his career, he met Thurlow Weed, who was the powerful editor of the Albany Evening Journal. Weed had been influential with the Whigs, now with the Republicans, and he liked the young Arthur, and he introduced him to Governor Edwin Morgan, who was also affiliated with Weed. Well, one other thing about Arthur, he had joined the New York militia. He had been named the Judge Advocate of the 2nd Brigade, and Morgan liked having military folks around. He liked Arthur personally, so he decided to make an appointment: Engineer-in-Chief. This was both a political appointment as well as a military one, so Chester Arthur was now a brigadier general in the New York State Militia. This was serious business. Unprecedented buildup of the military in the North. They had to find people who could figure out how to get provisions, where to place the soldiers in terms of getting their units together prior to going off to war. So Arthur was actually assigned to the quartermaster's office, and he got his hands dirty on this right away, and he was a natural. Disciplined, well organized, worked like a dog morning, noon, and night. In fact, this was kind of his specialty, was to being able to do some of his best work after midnight. Nothing's ever seemed to tire him. He was enjoying this work. It was intense, it was important, and he was doing a really good job. Such that Governor Morgan decided to promote him the following year. February of 1862, Morgan named Arthur the acting assistant Quartermaster General and the Inspector General of the state militia. What did that role mean? Well, his job was to review the readiness of the troops. He would travel to military installations across the state, performing assessments, making recommendations. Also had to enforce punishments sometimes for folks that were getting out of line. He even traveled into the field once, just once, to inspect some New York troops who were stationed in Fredericksburg, Virginia. This was a very awkward time and experience for Chester Arthur. Why? Well, his wife Nell's family, many of them were residing around Fredericksburg, and he was meeting them for the first time, very much opposite sides of this controversy, with him in a brigadier general uniform from the Union Army. They're very much pro-Confederate. His natural charm, he was able to charm some of the relatives into sort of seeing eye to eye with him, at least from a familial standpoint, but most didn't want to have anything to do with this Yankee brigadier general. Fortunately for Arthur, he didn't stay long. Governor Morgan wanted him back north. Frankly, his skills were too valuable to Morgan to be out in the field. There were times where there were discussions about having Arthur actually go lead men in battle. Morgan always said no. He needed Chester Arthur in the state capitol, working with him to do all the work behind the scenes to enable the war effort, and this was a hallmark for Chester Arthur. Always that top lieutenant, the guy who knew how to get stuff done. Well, 1862, the war wasn't going all that well for the North, and President Lincoln decided to call out 300,000 more volunteers from the North, and the biggest quota New York, 120,000 they were to raise and put out in the field. What did Governor Morgan do? He asked Chester Arthur to lead this effort. Arthur was named the Quartermaster General, and again, he dove in. A lot of lessons learned from the previous year. The biggest question, where was he going to put all these troops? And he ended up building about 200 barracks across New York, including in Central Park. Again, part of his hallmark was the financial accounting. Very impressive for Chester Arthur because he watched every penny and no charges of malfeasance ever came in the direction of Arthur. He took this very personally. He said once that if I misappropriated a cent and in walking downtown saw two men talking on the corner together, I would imagine they were talking of my dishonesty and the very thought would drive me mad. To his credit again, no charges of malfeasance despite millions of dollars in contracts bearing the signature and direction of Chester Arthur. No wrongdoing ever asserted in his direction. Arthur was not only proficient, he was also popular. And this whole role furthered his connections with the elite social circles within New York, which this is something that his wife Nell really liked. She was ambitious too. This was her sweet spot. And so even though he was away all hours of the night sometimes and she missed him, she understood this was part of the job and it was an opportunity for them to grow together. Now Arthur was 6'2", about 180 pounds, and he was very sociable. He liked to be at the table, and one of his friends once said he loved the pleasures of the table and had an extraordinary power of digestion and could carry a great deal of wine and liquor without any manifest effect other than greater vivacity of speech. He would grow well over 200 pounds and beyond later in his career. Again, social skills very much a key to his ingratiating with these elites within the North. He's working hard, getting stuff done. Times are good for Chester Arthur, but then it all changed. It's a political job, and the politics in New York changed. January 1 of 1863, the Democrats took over the state. Governor Morgan was out. All of his appointees were out, including Chester Arthur. On his way out the door, he got high praise from his replacement, a Democrat by the name of S.V. Talcott, who said, I found on entering on the discharge of my duties a well-organized system of labor and accountability for which the state is chiefly indebted to my predecessor, General Chester A. Arthur, who by his practical good sense and unremitting exertion at a period when everything was in confusion, reduced the operations of this department to a matured plan by which large amounts of money were saved to the government and great economy of time secured in carrying out the details of the same. High praise from somebody from the political opposition. Well, Arthur did have some opportunities to stay in the service, possibly to lead men in battle, but in this case, he said no and never really explained why. Some have speculated maybe it was that tension in the family with Nell and her family in the South, and going to actually battle might have been a problem. It might have been that he might have had to take a demotion from his general officer position if he was going to go lead men into battle. That was possibly on the table. Never really explained, but he certainly wasn't far from military activity. As he went back into civilian life, stood up his law practice again, his services were very much in demand, both for civil suits related to military activities, to crafting legislation, both at the state and national levels. Arthur was often on the road, Albany, Washington, D.C., back and forth, occasionally, of course, home to New York City. He was a very busy person here in the latter portion of the war. Then tragedy struck the family. 2.5-year-old William, their only child, suddenly died. This is July of 1863. Most of the North celebrating the military victories at Gettysburg and at Vicksburg, but not the Arthurs. They were in deep mourning, terrible sense of loss. Things got a little better the following year when they welcomed Chester Jr. into the world. They called him Allen, his middle name, so he could have kind of his identity of his own. And Arthur had poured himself into his work. Business was booming. They were actually able to buy a 2-story brownstone. This would be the last home they would ever have. Now, there was shifting to the world of politics. It was a real focal point at this point for Arthur as well. He had his relationships with Governor Morgan, who was now Senator Morgan from New York. He was back into politics, back in a seat. Relationships with Thurlow as well. And they were really pursuing what was called machine politics. What was this all about? Well, the whole point was to win elections. Not necessarily for ideology, but for power. The way they would do this is they would use the power of patronage to hand out jobs to their supporters and friends of their supporters, oftentimes regardless of whether or not they were qualified, but that would generate the support. And then what they would do is they would impose assessments on them. a percent of their salary, 1%, 2%, 3%, which would go into the coffers of the campaigns. For the next election, they'd win again, and the cycle would continue. This was machine politics, and it was fostered quite well in the state of New York. And again, this wasn't about ideology. As Dennis Brogan said, who was a member of this machine, the true character of the machine is its political indifferentism. It exists for itself, which was no problem for Chester Arthur. Because again, he liked being the number 2 guy, the number 3 guy, take those orders from the boss and make stuff happen. So not only was he aligned with Morgan, but he was aligned with Thomas Murphy. And Murphy and he actually had a lot to do with really standing up the Morgan machine. One of their roles was as collectors. They went out and got those assessments from these people who had gotten these political jobs. He was quite good at that. Organized, disciplined, firm, unrelenting. These were great qualities if you were going to be part of the machine. Well, Murphy himself decided to run for office, and Chester Arthur was all in. They operated out of Murphy's home, and one of his friends once said, sooner or later, but always unfailing, was the well-known ring and footstep of General Arthur, as we used to call him, always smiling and affectionate in his manner towards his friends, and apparently as attached to Mr. Murphy's family as though they were his nearest and dearest relatives. He was in his element, bantering all night with the boys, all hours of the night, drinking whiskey, smoking cigars, doing politics. Again, Nell was not around for a lot of this. She missed her husband, but she continued to recognize for her own and family's ambition, this was part of that role. And Chester Arthur loved it. Well, he also now wanted to cash in as well. He started to set his own sights on a patronage appointment. He was looking for the granddaddy of them all, the New York Custom House. Could he land a role there? That's the story for another day. That is Chester Arthur and finding his niche from the life of Chester Arthur. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.